morning students. Today we are going to discuss about History Chapter 1, the French Revolution. In our last class we discussed about French Revolution, French society. France becomes a constitutional monarchy. Am I right? Now we are going to discuss about France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. Students, what do you mean by monarchy? Yes, monarchy is the oldest form of government. Students, in a monarchy, a king or queen is head of state. That means a country that is ruled by a king or queen. Isn't it? Let us discuss about republic. Students, what do you mean by republic? Yes, republic is a form of government where the people elect the government, including the head of the government. Am I right? This is the difference between monarchy and a republic. Moving on to understand, France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. Students, rulers of France's neighboring countries were worried by the developments in France. So, they made plans to send troops to put down the events taking place since 1789. Before this could happen, the National Assembly declared war against Prussia and Austria in April 1792. Students, on that time, thousands of volunteers joined army. Among the patriotic songs sung by them was the Marseillaise composed by the poet Roger de l'Isle. Students, it later became the national anthem of France. It was sung for the first time by volunteers from Marseilles as they marched into Paris. Students, can you tell what was Marseilles? Who composed it? Yes, Marseilles was one of the patriotic songs sung by volunteers from Marseilles as they marched into Paris and got its name. It was composed by Roger de l'Isle. It is now the national anthem of France. Students, what was the decision taken by National Assembly in April 1792? Yes, National Assembly declared war against Prussia and Austria in April 1792. While men were busy fighting at the front, women had to earn a living and look after their families. A large segment of the population was convinced to carry the revolution further as the Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer section. People used to discuss government policies and their own plan of action in political clubs. The most successful club was the Club of Jacobins, which got its name from Convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Students, can you tell why were the political clubs formed in France? Yes, political clubs were formed by the people in France to discuss the policies of the government which gave the political rights only to the richer sections of the society and to plan their action. Both men and women formed various clubs. Let us discuss about the Jacobins clubs. Students, the most successful of the clubs was that of the Jacobins. It got its names from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Students, members of the Jacobins club belonged mainly to the less prosperous sections of society. For example, shopkeepers, artisans, cooks, shoemakers, watchmakers, printers, servants, and daily wage workers. Students, do you know who was the leader of the Jacobin Club? Yes, Robespierre was the leader of the Jacobin Club. Students, they dressed differently by wearing long striped trousers similar to those worn by dock workers. Students, dock workers means a longshoreman. It was a way of declaring the end of the power holded by the wearers of knee breeches. They came to be known as Sansculottes, meaning those without knee breeches. Sansculottes men wore a red cap that symbolized liberty. Students, on 10th August 1792, the Jacobins attacked the palace of Tuileries with large number of Parisians. They killed the king's guards and held the king himself as hostage for several hours. Later, the assembly voted to imprison the royal family. Students, do you know who were Sansculottes? Yes, the Jacobins came to be known as Sansculottes, which literally means those without knee breeches. Students, elections were held in August 1917, and now all men above 20 years of age were allowed to vote. The newly elected assembly, called the Convention, it abolished monarchy on 21st September 1792, and France was declared a republic. Students, Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. Students, treason means betrayal of one's country or government. Listen to it. After some time, the Queen Mary Antoinette was also sentenced to death. Students, can you tell why was Louis XVI sentenced to death? Yes, Louis XVI was sentenced to death on the charges of treason in January 1793. Let us discuss about the Reign of Terror. Students, do you know the period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror in France. At the time, Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. Many people were arrested and tried by a revolutionary tribunal. Students, tribunal means court. They included all those people who were considered enemies of republic by Robespierre. For example, ex-nobles, clergy, and members of political parties. Students, if the court found them guilty, they were guillotined. Students, what was guillotine? Yes, guillotine was a device consisting of two poles and a blade, using which a person was beheaded. It was named after Dr. Guillotine, who invented it. Students, peasants were forced to transport their grain to the cities and sell it at the prices fixed by the government. The use of expensive white flour was forbidden. Students, what do you mean by forbidden? Yes, not allowed. People were forced to eat the pain de égalité, that means equality bread, a loaf made of whole wheat. Students, instead of Monsieur and Madame, all French men and women were called as citoyen and citoyenne. Students, Monsieur means sir. Students, on that time, churches were shut down and their buildings were converted into barracks or offices. Students, Robespierre became a visual dictator of France. Due to his hard policies, his supporters left him in the end. He was finally convicted by a court and guillotined in July 1794. What was guillotine? Yes, guillotine was a device consisting of two poles and a blade, using which a person was beheaded. Am I right? Moving on to understand a directory rules in France. Students, directory was an executive body of 5 members. Directory was appointed by 2 elected legislative councils. After the fall of the Jacobins, the wealthier middle classes seized power. At that time, a new constitution was introduced which denied the vote to non-propertied society. Students, can you tell which class came into power after the fall of Jacobin government? Yes, the wealthier middle class came into power after the fall of Jacobin government. Am I right? Yes. Students, to whom the new constitution denied the vote? Yes. The new constitution of wealthier middle class government denied vote to non-propertied sections of society. It provided two elected legislative councils. These councils appointed a directory, an executive made up of 5 members. Isn't it? It was meant as a safeguard against the concentration of power in a one-man executive. Students, do you know why the executive body like directory was introduced? Yes, it was introduced to safeguard against the concentration of power in one-man executive as under the Jacobins. Listen to it. Students, the ideals of freedom, equality, and fraternity remained inspiring ideals that motivated political movements for France and the rest of the Europe. Moving on to understand role of women in revolution. Students, women played a very significant role in the French Revolution. See, most of the women belonging to the third estate worked for a living. Only the daughters of nobles and wealthier members of the third estate could study at a convent. Besides caring for their families, the French women had to cook, fetch water, stand in queues for bread, look after the children, etc. Students, their wages were always lower than the men. Students, do you know what was the status of education among women during French Revolution? Yes, most of the women did not have access to education or job training. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the third estate could study at a convent. Students, women in France were disappointed with the Constitution of 1791 because it reduced them to passive citizens who had no political rights. They demanded political rights, which right to vote, to be elected to the assembly, and to hold political office. Students, what did the women in France do to discuss and voice their interest? Yes, in order to discuss and voice their interest, the women started their political clubs and newspapers. Am I right? Students, the Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous club formed by women in France. Now we will discuss about laws passed to improve women's lives. In this concept, we will discuss about what did the revolutionary government do to improve the condition of women in France. Students, the revolutionary government in the early years introduced several laws to improve the condition of women in France. At first, state schools were created and schooling was made compulsory for all girls. That means they gained access to education with the introduction of state schools and a system of compulsory education for girls. Next, women could no longer be forced to marry against their wishes. That means women could no longer be forced into marriages by their fathers. They could marry at will. Students, marriage was made into a contract entered into freely and registered under civil law. That means marriage was now a contract which could be registered under civil law. Students, divorce was made legal and could be applied for both women and men. That means both men and women could apply for it. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists or run small businesses. Students, These laws were passed to improve the lives of women. Let us discuss about French women got a right to vote. Students, do you know? During the Reign of Terror, the government ordered for the closure of women's clubs and banned their political activities. Students, many prominent women were arrested and executed. Women's struggle for voting and equal political rights was carried on through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and the early 20th century. Finally, in 1946, French women owned the right to vote. Students, do you know when did French women got the political rights? Yes, in 1946, women in France got the political rights. Let us discuss about Olympiade Gauges. Students, Olympiade Gauges was one of the most important of the political active women in revolutionary France. You know, she protested against the constitution and the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. In 1791, she wrote a Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen, which she addressed the Queen and the members of the National Assembly. Students, in 1793, Olympiade Gauges criticized the Jacobin government. She was tried by the National Convention, which charged her with treason. Soon after, she was executed. Students, can you tell who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen? Yes, Olympiade Gauges wrote a Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen in 1791. Moving on to understand the abolition of slavery. Students, the greatest social reform made by the Jacobin government was to abolish slavery in French colonies. The French colonies in the Caribbean like Martinique, Guadeloupe and San Domingo were important suppliers of tobacco, indigo, sugar, coffee, etc. The French needed workers for plantations in her colonies, but the Europeans did not want to work in distant, unknown lands. Thus, a three-way trade in slaves started between Europe, Africa, and America in the 17th century. This was known as triangular slave trade. Student, what was the most revolutionary reform of the Jacobin government? Yes, the most revolutionary reform of the Jacobin government was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. Am I right? Students, French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast, where they bought slaves from local chieftains. Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France. After long debates, the National Convention passed a law in 1794. Students, it declared slavery illegal and freed all slaves in France's overseas colonies. After 10 years, Napoleon reintroduced slavery to please the plantation owners who considered enslaving African blacks as their right. Students, the slaves were known as African Negroes. Finally, slavery was abolished in the French colonies in 1848. Students, can you tell when did the slavery finally abolished in French colonies? Yes, in 1848, slavery was finally abolished from French colonies. Moving on to understand political symbols of France. Students, most of the people in the 18th century, France could not read and write. So, images and symbols instead of printed books were used to communicate ideas. Students, these symbols were used to convey the content of Declaration of Rights. Students, at first, broken chains. Usually, chains were used to restrain the slaves from running away. Am I right? Yes. Students, broken chains signify the act of becoming free. Next, a bundle of rats. It was used to convey the message that strength lies in unity. Next, the eye within or triangular radiating light. Students, the all-seeing eye stands for knowledge. The rays of the sun will drive away the dark clouds of ignorance. Next, scepter. It symbolizes royal power. Students, after that, snake biting its tail to form a ring. It symbolizes eternity. The ring has neither beginning nor end. Another symbol is red Phrygian cap. It was worn by slaves when they were freed. Students, next symbol is the winged women. It symbolizes personification of the law. The last symbol is the law tablet. Students, the law is same for all and all are equal before it. Moving on to understand the revolution and everyday life. Students, after 1789, many changes took place in the lives of women, men, and children in France. One important law that came into effect after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. Students, do you know which law came into effect soon after the incident of Bastille 1789? Yes, abolition of censorship came into effect after the incident of Bastille 1789. Students, one important law that came into effect after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. Listen to it. According to censorship, all written materials and cultural activities could be performed or published only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Students, with the abolition of censorship and the declaration of the rights of man and citizen, freedom of speech and expression became a natural right of man. Students, this led to the growth of newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures. See, freedom of the press gave voice to opinions and counter opinions. Let us discuss about dateline. Students, in 1774, Louis XVI became King of France. In 1804, Napoleon became Emperor of France. Students, in 1815, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. Students, in 1848, slavery was abolished in French colonies. In 1946, women in France won the right to vote. Students, now I am going to revise important terms. At first, treason. Students, treason means betrayal of one's country or government. Next, Negroes. Students, a term used for the indigenous people of Africa south of the Sahara. Next, citoyen. Students, French men are called citoyen. Citoyenne. Students, French women are called citoyenne. Let us discuss about the Jacobin Club. Students, what do you know about the Jacobin Club? Students, in France, people used to discuss government policies and their own plan of action in political clubs. The most successful club was the Club of Jacobins, which got its name from convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Listen to it. Students, members of the Jacobins Club belonged mainly to the less prosperous sections of society. They included shopkeepers, artisans, cooks, shoemakers, watchmakers, printers, servants, and daily wage workers. Robespierre was its leader. Students, do you know who were the members of the Jacobin Club? Name the leader. Yes, the members of the Jacobin Club were from the less prosperous sections of the French society. For example, small shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemakers, watchmakers, printers, servants, and daily wage workers. Their leader was Robespierre. Students, what do you mean by guillotine? Yes, guillotine was a device consisting of two poles and a blade using which a person was beheaded. It was named after Dr. Guillotine, who invented it. Students, now I am going to revise role of women in revolution. Women played a very important role in French Revolution. Most of the women belonging to the third estate worked for a living. Only the daughters of nobles and wealthier members of the third estate could study at a convent. Besides caring for their families, the French women had to cook, fetch water, stand in queues for bread, look after the children, etc. Their wages were always lower than the men. Students, women in France were disappointed with the Constitution of 1791 because it reduced them to passive citizens who had no political rights. So they demanded political rights. Students, do you know what did the revolutionary government do to improve the condition of women in France? The revolutionary government in the early years introduced several laws to improve the condition of women in France. At first, state schools were created and schooling was made compulsory for all girls. That means they gained access to education with the introduction of state schools and a system of compulsory education for girls. Next, women could no longer be forced to marry against their wishes. That means women could no longer be forced into marriages by their fathers. They could marry at will. Students, marriage was made into a contract, entered into freely and registered under civil law. Am I right? That means marriage was now a contract which could be registered under civil law. Listen to it. Divorce was made legal and could be applied for by both women and men. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists, or run small business. Students, these laws were passed to improve the lives of women. Now I am going to revise features of the Constitution of 1791. Students, the Constitution of 1791 vested the power to make laws in the National Assembly, which was indirectly elected. That is, citizens voted for a group of electors who in turn chose the assembly. Students, under the new constitution, the laws were to be made by the National Assembly. Listen to it. The assembly was indirectly elected. For example, active citizens voted for a group of electors who in turn chose the assembly members. Students, men who were above 25 years of age and who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer's wage were given the status of active citizens. Listen to it. For example, they had right to vote. The remaining men and all women were classified as passive citizens. That means not all citizens had the right to vote. Only men above 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer's wage were given the status of active citizens. The remaining men and all women were classified as passive citizens. Students, to qualify as an elector and then as a member of the assembly, a man had to belong to the highest bracket of taxpayers. Students, the Constitution began with a declaration of rights of man and citizen, such as the right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, and equality before law. These were established as natural rights, and it was the duty of the state to protect these. Students, these laws were made by the National Assembly. The Assembly was indirectly elected. Let us recall the importance of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen in France. Students, the 5 values associated with Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen are right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality, and liberty. Students, at first, right to life. Students, what do you mean by right to life? Yes, everyone has the right to live in his or her own way. Listen to it. There would not be any restrictions from the state. Next, freedom of speech. Students, freedom of speech means every citizen is entitled to speak whatever he or she thinks right. Next, freedom of opinion. Students, what do you mean by freedom of opinion? Yes, every citizen is entitled to write or express his or her own opinion freely. Listen to it. Next, equality. Students, equality means equal to all. Am I right? Students, law is the expression of the general will. All citizens have the right to participate in its formation, personally or through their representatives. All citizens are equal before it. Moving on to understand liberty. Students, it consists of the power to do whatever is not injurious to others. Students, let us recall triangular slave trade. Students, the French needed workers for plantations in her colonies. But the Europeans did not want to work in distant, unknown lands. Thus, a three-way trade in slaves started between Europe, Africa, and America in the 17th century. This trade was known as triangular slave trade. Students, can you tell what was the root of triangular slave trade? Yes, the triangular slave trade was executed between the continents of Europe, Africa, and America. Students, do you know what was the condition of slave trade in the 17th century? Students, as the slave trade began in 17th century, the slaves were bought from local chieftains. After branding and shackling, the slaves were packed tightly into ships for the 3 months long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Student, what do you mean by voyage? Yes, travel. After the African coast, they were sold to plantation owners. Students, can you tell why had the exploitation of slave labor done? Yes, the exploitation of slave labor had done to meet the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Students, name the ports of France from where the slave trade was carried out. The slave trade was carried out from the ports of Bordeaux and Nantes. The slave trade was carried out from the ports of Bordeaux and Nantes. Students, list 4 commodities supplied by the French colonies in the Caribbean. Yes, the French colonies in the Caribbean were important suppliers of tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. Students, what do you mean by Estate General? Yes, the Estate General was a political body and was controlled by the French monarch. Students, what do you mean by monarch? Monarch means king. Students, what do you mean by clergy? Yes, the French society was divided into three estates in the 18th century, isn't it? The first estate was comprised of the clergy. Students, clergy means group of persons invested with special functions in the church. Moving on to understand Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen. Students, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen? Yes, Olumbidi Gorges wrote a Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen in 1791. Students, who was Olumbidi Gorges? Yes, Olumbidi Gorges was one of the most important of the political active women in revolutionary France. Listen to it. She protested against the Constitution and Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. In 1791, she wrote a Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen, which she addressed the Queen and the members of the National Assembly. In 1793, Olumbidi Gorges criticized the Jacobin government for closing down women's clubs. She was tried by the National Convention, which charged her with treason. Soon after, she was executed. Let us discuss about conclusion. Students, what do you mean by conclusion? Yes, the end or finish of an event or process. Students, in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte, a famous French general, crowned himself Emperor of France. He annexed neighboring European countries, disposed dynasties, and created kingdoms where they placed members of his family. Students, he saw himself as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. Students, many people saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people. But soon his army came to be viewed everywhere as invader force. Finally, Napoleon was defeated at the Waterloo in 1815. Even after his defeat, ideas of Napoleon on liberty and modern laws continued in other parts of Europe. Students, the ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution, which spread all over Europe. This led to abolition of feudal system and freedom of colonized nations. Students, Tipu Sultan and Rajaram Mohan Rai are some of the Indians who were inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution. Students, where was Napoleon defeated? Yes, Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Can you tell? Name the two Indian individuals who responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. Yes, the two Indian individuals who responded to the ideas coming from revolutionary France were Rajaram Mohan Rai and Tipu Sultan. Students, do you know who crowned himself as Emperor of France? Yes, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself as Emperor of France in 1804. Students, can you tell what actions proved Napoleon as modernizer of Europe? Yes, he introduced many laws like a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system and protection of private property. Students, can you tell which right was given to the French women in 1946? Yes, right to vote. Thank you.